for some that don't know your background, if you don't mind taking a moment and sharing your background, that'd be great.
How long do you have?
Yeah, we got 2 hours.
I could start from the beginning, but I'll give you the short version, and you can unpick it as you like. Then
absolutely.
So I joined Hizb ut-Tahrir at the age of 16 after facing some very severe, violent, racist attacks where I grew up in Essex in the UK, being the number of people that looked like me you could count on perhaps one hand. And it was a very different time. We were the first generation born and raised in the UK to Muslim parents, and so it was an interesting experiment because we are I'm 45 years old now, so we were the first generation to have this these questions around identity in the West being Muslim. Our parents as migrants never really had to face those questions because they were always the migrants who came. So they were still always, in my case, my parents came from Pakistan. They were Pakistani migrants in Britain. But we, being born and raised there, had to kind of grapple with these questions of what it meant to be a Muslim born in the West. So when we were facing a lot of that violent racism, and I'm talking machete attacks, hammer attacks. When I say violent, it was brutal. I witnessed my first murder at 17, stabbing to death.
Who was doing the attacking? These were native-born British?
So this was a group of neo-Nazis. They affiliated with Combat 18, which is it was formed as a paramilitary organisation in Northern Ireland by serving soldiers who were fighting the Irish republicanism there, and they became uber-nationalist in that sense. And 18 stands for the order of the letters in the alphabet of Adolf Hitler's initials, so A being 1 and H being 8. These were guys, they weren't messing around. Multiple friends of ours had either had hammers put to their heads and stabbed all over their bodies. And I'd been, as I say, but before that murder at 17, but most of my, I witnessed more knife fights in my teenage years than most people, and participated in, than most people will have in their entire lives. That has a brutalizing effect on the psychology of a young boy. So at 16, with the Bosnia genocide unfolding in Europe against, again, in Srebrenica in particular, against Muslims, I became very, very disassociated from society, became very angry with the world, and at 16, as I say, joined Hizb ut-Tahrir. That took me on another sort of chapter. It was a long journey. I ended up on their leadership. I ended up exporting the group from Britain to Denmark to Pakistan, where I was one of the first British Pakistani members to co-found the organisation in Pakistan. Our aim was to create a global theocracy in the name of my faith tradition, which I still adhere to and do not reject whatsoever, just to make that clear to everybody. What I critiqued was the politicisation of that faith tradition. But the aim at the time, we wanted to create a global theocracy that would impose one reading of that faith tradition over society by law. Ironically, a very European Westphalian concept, which was owed more to colonialism and the interwar fascism period than it did to the tradition, to the pluralistic tradition of Islam. But that's what we discuss in that book you mentioned with Sam Harris. But I ended up, as I say, exporting this revolution to various countries. Ended up in Egypt. I landed one day before the 9/11 attacks, and the security climate around the world completely changed. And though we were non-violent, we were, if you like, we were the Trotskys to the Stalins of that kind of world. So we were more on the intellectual revolutionary side as opposed to violence. 9/11 changed the calculation for everybody. And in Egypt, they had a security roundup after 9/11, and we were rounded up with hundreds of Egyptians. We were then blindfolded. We had our hands tied behind our backs with rags. They'd run out of handcuffs. They'd rounded up so many people. We were then taken into their dungeons where they began torturing everybody with electrocution. Eventually, we were, after a period of solitary confinement, I think about 3.5 months, eventually we were put on trial, and I was sentenced to 5 years as a political prisoner, tried by an emergency court in Egypt, not under the constitutional setup, but tried in the state of emergency that Hosni Mubarak had kept in that country since the assassination of Anwar Sadat in 1981. The country never left the state of emergency, so they were able to arbitrarily detain people. They had, forget Guantanamo Bay, to be honest, it was a picnic compared to what we saw. They had people in prisons without charge and without trial for over 20 years. But in addition to the torture, which wasn't just stress positions as it is. And I say just, obviously, every form of torture is abhorrent. But what we see in the press about Guantanamo Bay and even Abu Ghraib was nothing compared to what was going on inside these prisons. All, mind you, while Tony Blair was taking free holidays, being hosted by Hosni Mubarak while we were in those prisons, as the letters have recently been leaked where Cherie Blair, his wife, has been discussing those free holidays. I don't forget things like that. But either way, we were sentenced to 5 years, at which point we were adopted by Amnesty International as prisoners of conscience, because, as I say, there was no suggestion, even in the trial, of any violence. And I spent the next 5 years in 4 and a bit, to be precise, in Mazra'at Ora prison with the surviving assassins of the former president, Anwar Sadat, with the leaders and founders of all of the jihadi as well as Islamist groups in Egypt at the time. The leaders and founders of Jama'ah al-Islamiyya.
You're all in there together.
In there together. As I say, the assassins of Anwar Sadat were there. Those who weren't executed in the case, they all became friends of mine. The leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Dr. Muhammad al-Badi', who wasn't the leader at the time, he is now. Muhammad Mursi, who since died, he became the leader after Mubarak was overthrown. Ayman Noor was a liberal prisoner from Hizb al-Ghad. So we had pretty much, it was a political university.
How long were you guys all together?
For the entire time in that prison. So I was there for just over 4 years.
So is this, if I'm painting a picture in my mind, was this daily conversations, debates, going through history, ideas being talked about? Is that kind of how it was?
Absolutely. I was a student at the time. I was studying Arabic. I'm a graduate in the Arabic language from SOAS, part of the University of London. And that's ostensibly why I went to Egypt. So I continued with my studies. I spent that time in prison studying all aspects of Islamic theology, Islamic exegesis, Quran recitation and memorization, Arabic language, the Fusha, the classical Arabic language, Usul al-Fiqh, which is the jurisprudence, Ilm al-Hadith, the science of Hadith interpretation. Because we had people in there that there was no rhyme or reason as to who was thrown in there other than suspicion of it by a dictator. So you had genuine scholars in there as well, and I spent most of my time studying and debating.
Who was most convincing? And simply because they were good at debating, and who was most convicted in their beliefs?
I have very little difficulty differentiating between polemicists and substance, because I spent most of my life training other people in how to argue and convince people. So for me, it wasn't about polemics. And
you spend most of your life teaching people how to argue and debate.
Yeah, because Hizb ut-Tahrir's methodology was ideological propaganda. We trained people in some of the tactics you saw during the COVID period, which we can come to, weren't new to me at all. We would train people in the methods of dissemination of ideas for the purposes of ideological warfare. And that's why we were put in jail, because that was deemed very dangerous. Our purpose was to recruit army officers and to eventually convince them to instigate military coups.
Did you succeed?
I've recruited a few army officers, yeah, in Pakistan and mainly in Pakistan, actually, the people I spoke to at the time.
So if you can go back and again, for you to be in there, it's kind of like a story of somebody saying, yeah, I was in Rucker, Park, and I was there, and for about 2 years it was me, Michael, such and such, and Kobe, and all these. I mean, obviously these guys come from different eras, but if you put all of them at the same time and they're all think tank for 2 years, what are those games like? So what are the conversations like? So for me, what I'm asking you is, who was most convincing where you sat there and you said, that's a very good point they're making for doing this? For example, if we make an argument of U.S. is the biggest enemy and here's what they're doing, and you're like, okay, that's a very good argument I've never heard before, versus who was 100% convicted that you couldn't sway them at all based on your memories?
So by the time we got in, there was a movement afoot in Egypt and across the Islamic world of what was called the Muraja'at, which is the revisions of jihadist ideology. And there were books written by some of the leaders of these jihadi groups, by the leaders of Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, for example. I still have those books at home in Arabic with my handwritten annotations on the sidelines of those books. And these were revisions of jihadist thought that I think were profoundly impactful, and they were genuine. and really influential in convincing a lot of these more hardcore militant ideologues that violence isn't the way to bring about change.
Isn't.
Yeah. Terroristic violence is not the way to bring about political change. So they were conversations we were having, as I say, with former members, founders and leaders of Jama'ah al-Islamiyya. The assassins of Sadat had also come to those conclusions and had abandoned their former jihadist ideology. If Islamism is the desire to impose one version of Islam over society, jihadism is the use of force to bring about Islamism. Just to be clear, and when I use those terms, that's what I mean. That's very distinct from Islam and jihad. Islam is a faith tradition that is known. It's one of the Abrahamic faiths, and Allah in Aramaic means God. Jesus, when he spoke Aramaic, would say Allah or Elohim.
Allah. Allah. When it's Syrian Aramaic, we say Allah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it just means the same word. It's the same source. God, I don't use as a word because I think it's loaded in the English language. So even in English, when I'm speaking, I prefer to say Allah, just so people understand that ultimately we're speaking of the same subject matter here. And Islam in that sense is distinct from Islamism, the desire to impose Islam over society. Jihad, coming back to those terms, again, means struggle. So in the verb, you can say, ujahidu, it just means I struggle. And then, of course, there are many various manifestations of struggle. Primarily, our enemy is within us. And our solution often and always actually is within us as well. So struggle should be seen in that context of the struggle to overcome ourselves. It can be a struggle against the other in many instances, such as occupation. I'm no pacifist. If somebody invades Britain, I will fight. And so I think that jihadism, though, is the use of force to impose Islamism. So that's why I define these terms. So we're not talking of Islam and jihad. Back to your question, I haven't forgotten. In the prisons, there were people that were still subscribing to the Islamist and jihadist ideologies and wanted to either use force to impose that on others or take over a system and do so. But most of the leaders and founders of those organizations by then had come around to this idea that violence wasn't the way. So ironically, we were the ideologues when we entered that jail. Now, ordinarily, when you go through torture, it makes you even more angry, even more entrenched in your view, and even less willing to compromise because of the anger and because of the inability to separate the pain and the anguish and the trauma from what you experienced from being able to think clearly. I don't know, for whatever reason, in my case, I spent those 5 years debating and discussing. By the end of it, I read all those books I mentioned, the Muraja'at, or the revisions in the jihadist thinking. By the end of it, even though I didn't leave the group until a year after my departure from Mazarat or a prison, I could no longer sustain my own conviction that what I had thought was Islam, the faith, and therefore needed to be proselytized, was what I had come to believe. I could no longer sustain that conviction, and so I had to leave. So I'd say I became influenced by these people that you were asking of, those that in their older years had matured and
any
in their wisdom.
Specific one, any one above the other?
No, it was
collective.
Yeah, it was a collective group of and it was so diverse and different. I mean, I mentioned Ayman Noor from Hizb al-Ghad. He was a liberal political prisoner. We had Saad ad-Din Ibrahim, was quite a well-known Egyptian sociologist who was jailed for questioning Mubarak's attempt to give power to his son afterwards, Jamal Mubarak. And yet we had communists in there. Obviously, the majority were Islamists and jihadis. But just to give you an idea, there were people that had converted to Christianity that were thrown in jail for being apostates, from Islam to Christianity, and there were people that converted to Islam that were thrown in jail. I mean, we had a running joke at the time in prison that under Hosni Mubarak's Egypt, if you change your mind from anything to anything, it doesn't matter which way you go, thinking is what would get you put into prison. So imagine the diversity of thought. It was really, for me, that was my real university.
So if you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click right here. And if you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.